Well, 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 Margaret Smith, this isn't really your scene, is it? The voice stopped me mid-step as I was following the maitre d' to my table at Listis, Chicago's only three-star Michelin restaurant. My heart skipped a beat as I turned, immediately recognizing that voice even after all these years. There stood Edward Harris, lounging at a corner table with a glass of Bordeaux in one hand and that same smirk on his face I remembered from decades ago. Seated across from him was a woman at least 20 years his senior, dressed impeccably in Chanel, a large diamond glittering on her manicured hand. I smoothed my black dress self-consciously, suddenly aware of how the silver strands in my hair caught the restaurant's soft lighting. At 55, I had learned to embrace the physical changes that came with age, but being caught off guard like this brought back a flood of insecurities I thought I'd left behind. Edward, I managed, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in my chest. What a surprise. I bet, he replied, his eyes traveling over my outfit with poorly disguised judgment. I noticed how he dyed his hair to hide the gray, the slight sheen of it unnatural under the lights. The subtle tightening around his eyes suggested Botox, his desperate attempt to cling to youth. Don't worry, the waiters here are used to explaining the menu to newcomers, though I doubt you'll appreciate the culinary artistry. Remember how you used to think Olive Garden was fancy Italian? The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably. Edward, don't be rude. She touched his arm lightly, embarrassment evident in her expression. Just catching up with an old friend, Victoria, he told her, patting her hand dismissively. Margaret and I go way back. We dated in college before I upgraded my standards. I'm Margaret Smith, 55 years old, and until this moment, I'd been looking forward to a quiet business dinner at Lististe. I'd spent the afternoon finalizing details for a new product line with my team and wanted to celebrate the successful partnership that had doubled our company's revenue in the past year. What I hadn't wanted was to run into the man who'd shattered my heart 25 years ago, especially not while he was clearly playing boy toy to a wealthy older woman. Madam, your table is ready whenever you are, the maitre d' murmured discreetly beside me. Edward raised an eyebrow, the wrinkles at the corners crinkling despite his cosmetic efforts. You're dining alone? Bold choice for someone who used to be too intimidated to order coffee without me there to help. Actually, I began, but he cut me off. Let me guess, you're here to network? Still trying to break into the food industry with that little blog of yours? His laugh was sharp-edged, designed to wound. Some advice from an old friend. Places like this are for people who've actually made it, not aspirational tourists. The woman, Victoria, looked mortified now. Edward, that's enough. But the damage was done. 25 years melted away in an instant, and I was once again the insecure culinary school dropout who'd believed Edward when he said I'd never succeed without him. The woman who'd cried for weeks after he'd left her for someone who could open doors to the exclusive world he'd always craved. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my years, not as a burden, but as armor. I was no longer that young, wounded woman. I'd weathered divorce, menopause, and rebuilt my life from scratch in my 40s. Your usual table by the kitchen window is prepared, Ms. Smith, the maitre d' said a bit louder this time. Chef Daniels mentioned he's looking forward to getting your feedback on the new tasting menu. Edward's smirk faltered slightly. Before I could respond, my phone chimed with a text message. I glanced down to see it was from Robert. Running 10 minutes late. Order the Krug Grande for us and don't let anyone steal my beautiful wife before I get there. As I looked back up, I caught Edward staring at my left hand, where a platinum wedding band now sat. His expression shifted into something calculating, and I realized with a sinking feeling that our unexpected reunion was just beginning. Past relationship. Edward and I met during my second year at the Culinary Institute in New York, when I was 30 years old and bursting with ambition. He was charismatic, ambitious, and seemed genuinely interested in my dream of creating accessible gourmet food products. We'd bonded over shared childhood experiences, both raised in working-class families in Michigan, both determined to escape our modest beginnings. When I received the devastating news that my mother, Maureen, had been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, Edward had been supportive, at least initially. I withdrew from school to care for her in our small hometown of Lansing, managing her medical appointments while working 2 jobs to help with the mounting bills. Edward stayed in New York, promising to visit when he could, but those visits grew increasingly infrequent as months passed. Long distance is hard, he'd say during our late night phone calls, his voice growing more distant each time. But we'll make it work. You'll come back to New York once your mom is better, and we'll pick up where we left off. I believed him because I needed to. Needed something to hold on to during the grueling 18 months of mom's treatment, as I watched my own youth slipping away in hospital waiting rooms and pharmacy lines. During that time, I started a food blog as a creative outlet, developing recipes that were both nutritious and appealing to someone undergoing chemotherapy. To my surprise, the blog gained a following among other caregivers and cancer patients. After mom went into remission, I planned my return to New York, excited to reunite with Edward and resume my culinary education. That's when everything fell apart. I've met someone, he told me over the phone one winter evening as I sat alone in my mother's hospital room while she slept. The casualness in his voice made it all the more painful, as if he were commenting on the weather. Her name is Veronica. She's on the board of the James Beard Foundation. You're leaving me? I managed to ask through the shock, my free hand gripping the worn plastic chair. Let's be realistic, Margaret, he replied, using the shortened version of my name he knew I disliked. You've been away for almost 2 years. Your career is basically at a standstill, while I've made connections with people who actually matter in this industry. When I pointed out that I could return to school, that my blog was gaining traction, he'd scoffed. A little home cooking blog isn't going to open doors. Veronica has already introduced me to 3 Michelin-starred chefs. That's the kind of connection that makes a career. I'd hung up, devastated but determined not to let him see me crumble. 2 days later, I saw social media photos of Edward at a gala, his arm around a sophisticated woman in her early 50s. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. He'd left me, barely in my 30s, for an older woman who could advance his career. Now, in his 50s, he was still playing the same game. The pain of that betrayal mingled with my mother's illness and my own sense of lost youth. In those dark nights after Edward's call, I would stare at my reflection, seeing the first fine lines appearing around my eyes, wondering if I'd ever have the chance to rebuild. Despite the heartbreak, I channeled my energy into building something meaningful, though the road ahead seemed overwhelmingly steep for a woman starting over in her 30s. Mom's improved health allowed me to move to Chicago, where I leveraged my blog's following to launch a line of meal kits designed for cancer patients. It was modest at first, a small commercial kitchen, direct-to-consumer sales, tiny profit margins, but it was mine. Every success, however small, helped rebuild the confidence Edward had shattered. What I didn't know then was that Edward was tracking my progress. Occasional likes on business posts, mutual connections mentioning him asking about me. At the time, I interpreted it as friendly interest, perhaps even regret. I never suspected he was monitoring my career with growing resentment, watching as the little home cooking blog evolved into something that would eventually eclipse his own achievements. Looking back now, from the perspective of my mid-50s, there were signs I missed. Subtle digs wrapped in congratulatory messages, backhanded compliments when we occasionally crossed paths at industry events. Impressive for someone who didn't finish culinary school, he'd say, or a nice niche market you found, focusing on older consumers. Smart to stay in your lane. 4 years after the breakup, 4 years after our breakup, when I was in my mid-40s and beginning to find my footing again, my company, Nourished by Margaret, had expanded beyond meal kits to include a line of specialty sauces and spice blends. We'd just been featured in Food and Wine magazine when I received an email from Edward with the subject line, "Congratulations, potential collaboration." It seemed professional, friendly even. He explained that he was now the executive chef at Veronica's newly opened bistro in Manhattan and proposed carrying my products in their retail section. "Your story would resonate with our clientele," he wrote. "Plus, it would be great to reconnect after all this time." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him during my next trip to New York. The bistro was elegant without being pretentious, and seeing Edward in his chef whites, confidently directing his kitchen staff, I felt a twinge of what might have been nostalgia. Though I noticed he'd already begun dyeing his hair, even then in his early 40s. "You've done well for yourself," he said, giving me a tour of the restaurant. his eyes frequently darting to his reflection in the polished surfaces. Small scale, of course, but impressive considering where you started and, well, your age. I bit back a retort about the condescension in small scale and the unnecessary comment about my age, and instead focused on the business opportunity. My products would gain exposure in a new market, and the profit margins looked promising. Over lunch, Edward reminisced about our time together, carefully editing history to cast himself in a more favorable light. I always knew you had potential, he insisted, casually adjusting his chef's jacket to appear more trim. Sometimes people need space to grow in different directions. By dessert, he proposed an exclusive partnership. My products would be available only at his bistro in the New York market for 1 year, with potential to expand to Veronica's other restaurants if sales were strong. Speaking of Veronica, I ventured, noticing the slight tightening around his eyes at her name. Will she be involved in this decision? Edward's expression tightened momentarily, fine lines showing despite his efforts. Veronica and I have transitioned to a purely professional relationship. She's more of a mentor now. I later learned from an industry contact that Veronica had ended their romantic relationship over a year earlier, but continued to support his career. Apparently, she tired of his youthful arrogance, as my contact delicately phrased it, and his increasingly obvious concerns about their age difference. We finalized the partnership details over the next few weeks. I was cautiously optimistic about this professional reconciliation, even allowing myself to wonder if Edward had genuinely matured. The contract was set to begin the following month, with an initial order large enough to justify expanding my production capacity. 3 days before the launch, I received a terse email. Need to postpone the partnership indefinitely. Unforeseen circumstances. We'll be in touch. Confused and concerned, I called Edward repeatedly. No answer. I reached out to his sous chef, who reluctantly revealed that Edward had left the bistro in New York abruptly. Apparently, he'd accepted a position at an upscale resort in Aspen, working for another wealthy older woman who'd been impressed by both his culinary skills and his charm. The expanded production capacity I'd invested in now threatened to bankrupt my company. Thousands of dollars in specialty packaging with exclusively for Veronica's Bistro labels sat in my warehouse, unusable. 3 new employees hired specifically for the increased production faced potential layoffs. When I finally reached Edward a week later, his response was breathtakingly callous. Business opportunities change. You should know that better than anyone, he said dismissively. Maybe this is a sign you should stick to your little blog and meal kits. Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues, especially at your stage of life. I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by invoices for equipment I couldn't afford and payroll obligations I couldn't meet, feeling every one of my 45 years weighing on me. The dim light highlighted the new strands of gray in my hair reflected in my computer screen, and for a moment, I wondered if Edward was right, if I was too old to be starting over again, too old to compete in this youth-obsessed industry. Then I thought of my mother, who at nearly 70 had fought cancer with a dignity and strength I could only hope to possess. I thought of the women who wrote to me, grateful for meals that helped them or their loved ones through treatment. For the first time since our breakup, I allowed myself to cry over Edward Harris, not for love lost, but for my own foolishness in trusting him again. When the tears dried, they were replaced by a cold, clear determination. I would save my company, my employees' jobs, and my reputation. And I would never allow Edward to impact my life again. What I didn't realize then was that our paths were destined to cross once more, under circumstances neither of us could have predicted. Company crisis and recovery. The collapse of the partnership with Edward nearly destroyed everything I'd built. I had 2 weeks of operating capital left, thousands in debt, and a warehouse full of unusable product. At 45, the prospect of starting over yet again felt daunting in ways it hadn't in my 30s. In desperation, I reached out to every contact in my network, searching for alternative distribution channels. Most responses were sympathetic but unhelpful, with several subtly suggesting that my mature market focus might be limiting my appeal. I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning, counting the gray hairs and fine lines that seemed to have multiplied overnight with the stress. Maybe this business isn't meant for someone my age, I whispered to myself, echoing Edward's cruel assessment. Then came a call from Sarah Thompson, a former blog subscriber who now worked in product development for Whole Harvest, a national grocery chain known for featuring artisanal brands. I've been following your company since the blog days, Sarah said, her enthusiasm evident even through the phone. Send me samples of everything you've got, including the bistro line. I think there's a fit with our premium stores. And Margaret, your experience is an asset, not a liability. We're looking for authentic stories and proven expertise. It was a lifeline, but barely. Even if Whole Harvest picked up my products, the timeline for onboarding new vendors typically took months. I needed a solution in weeks. After a sleepless night of contemplation, I made the difficult decision to be transparent with my team. I failed you, I admitted during our emergency meeting, fighting the quaver in my voice. Jessica, my marketing director, was barely in her 40s while the rest of my small staff were all under 35. I couldn't help wondering if they saw me as past my prime. I let a personal connection cloud my business judgment, and now our company is at risk. To my surprise, instead of anger or resignation, I was met with determination. My small team rallied, proposing cost-cutting measures and alternative revenue streams. Jessica, who had previously worked for a major food corporation, was particularly supportive. Margaret, your story is your strength, she insisted, her eyes bright with conviction. A Save Nourish campaign could generate immediate cash flow while we secure long-term distribution. Your journey, creating recipes during your mother's illness, rebuilding your career in midlife, developing products that help people during their most vulnerable moments, that's what makes us unique. It felt uncomfortably vulnerable to share my personal story so publicly, especially the parts that highlighted my age, but I agreed. We launched a heartfelt video explaining our situation, featuring me in my kitchen, gray hair and laugh lines unapologetically visible, offering special bundles of our products with significant pre-order discounts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Loyal customers, blog followers, and cancer support groups mobilized to support us. Messages poured in from women my age and older who saw themselves in my story, who appreciated products developed by someone who understood their needs and preferences. As we scrambled to fulfill orders, Sarah called with unexpected news. Whole Harvest wants to fast-track your products for their holiday showcase, featuring us in 30 premium locations, she announced. Your campaign struck a chord with our marketing team. They love the authenticity, and frankly, they're excited to partner with a brand that speaks to consumers over 40, a demographic with significant spending power that's often overlooked. It wasn't a complete solution, but combined with the direct sales, it would keep us afloat. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Perhaps Edward had done me a favor. His betrayal had forced me to embrace my authentic self, age and all, and that authenticity was resonating with customers in ways I hadn't anticipated. Just as things were looking up, I received an email from an unfamiliar address, Victoria Montgomery at montgomeryhospitality.com. Miss Smith, I recently sampled your fire-roasted tomato sauce at a colleague's home and was impressed by both the product and your company's origin story. Montgomery Hospitality is expanding our boutique hotel restaurants to feature more artisanal products with meaningful narratives. I believe your line would be an excellent fit for our Chicago location's new concept. If you're interested in discussing a potential partnership, I'm available to meet next week. Regards, Victoria Montgomery, CO Montgomery Hospitality Group. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. A quick Google search revealed Victoria Montgomery was a respected figure in luxury hospitality, a woman in her late 60s who had built her empire from scratch and was known for mentoring female entrepreneurs. This could be the game-changing opportunity we needed, assuming it didn't disappear like the last one. Meeting Victoria, we met the following Wednesday at her office overlooking Michigan Avenue. Victoria Montgomery was gracious, sophisticated, and impressively knowledgeable about both my products and my company's history. At 68, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that immediately put me at ease. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and she wore her age as comfortably as she wore her obviously expensive but understated suit. I followed your journey with interest, she said, pouring tea from a silver service. Your resilience is admirable. Reinventing oneself in midlife requires a courage few possess. I felt an immediate kinship with this woman who had clearly weathered her own storms. It wasn't always courage, I admitted. Sometimes it was simply having no other choice. Victoria's smile deepened the lines around her eyes, lines she'd clearly never tried to erase with surgery or injections. Necessity is often the mother of both invention and reinvention. Either way, you've created something valuable. The meeting went exceptionally well. Victoria proposed featuring my complete product line at the Artisan, her flagship hotel restaurant in Chicago, with potential expansion to all Montgomery properties if the initial launch was successful. We're preparing to relaunch the Artisan with a new concept and new executive chef, she explained, her manicured hands gently holding her teacup. Your products align perfectly with our vision of authentic, experience-driven cuisine. The terms she offered were fair, the timeline aggressive but manageable. It seemed almost too good to be true, until we were finalizing details and Victoria casually mentioned her executive chef. He's quite talented, though sometimes his ego exceeds his abilities, she said with a slight smile that suggested she wasn't particularly impressed by his self-importance. You might know him. Edward Harris. He mentioned you were acquaintances from culinary school. My blood ran cold. The teacup rattled slightly in my hand as I set it down. Edward is your executive chef? I asked, hearing the strain in my voice. Victoria's perceptive eyes narrowed slightly, missing nothing. For now, she replied cryptically. Is that a problem? I hesitated, weighing the opportunity against the prospect of working with Edward again. My heart raced with anxiety, but also with a certain indignation. Why should I give up this opportunity because of him? Haven't I already surrendered enough of my career to his influence? We do have history, I admitted, smoothing my skirt with slightly trembling hands. Not entirely positive. Victoria studied me thoughtfully, her experienced gaze seeming to read volumes in my expression. I suspected as much from his reaction when I mentioned considering your products. Perhaps you could elaborate? I gave her a condensed version of our past, including the failed partnership. I was conscious of keeping my tone professional, though discussing Edward's betrayals made my voice tighten with suppressed emotion. To my surprise, Victoria didn't seem shocked. This confirms some concerns I've had about Edward's professional judgment, she said carefully, adjusting a silver bracelet on her wrist. His talent is undeniable, but his character. She let the thought hang unfinished. Nevertheless, I see potential in your products that stands independent of any personal complications. We proceeded with the agreement, and I left feeling cautiously optimistic, though my stomach churned at the thought of facing Edward again. In the elevator down from Victoria's office, I caught my reflection in the polished doors, my shoulders slightly hunched, my expression worried. Consciously, I straightened my posture, lifted my chin. I was no longer the younger woman Edward had discarded, no longer the middle-aged entrepreneur he'd tried to sabotage. At 55, I had earned every gray hair, every line around my eyes. They were badges of survival, not marks of shame. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on your deal with Victoria. Small world, isn't it? Looking forward to working together again. We should meet to discuss menu integration. Dinner tomorrow? Edward. The message's smug tone made it clear Edward believed he had the upper hand in this situation, that somehow, despite his previous betrayal, I would be forced to accommodate him to secure this crucial partnership. What he didn't know was that I was no longer the same woman who had trusted him twice and paid the price. This time, I would be prepared. I showed the message to Jessica during our morning meeting. He assumes I'll just fall in line, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Then show him how wrong he is, Jessica replied, her expression fierce with loyalty. You've rebuilt your company from nothing, twice. He's just another chef playing the same tired games. With renewed determination, I texted Edward back. I'm available at 6. The Sage Bistro on Halsted would be convenient. Professional, concise, and on my terms. Meeting with Edward, I agreed to meet Edward at a casual bistro, neutral territory where we could discuss the partnership professionally. When I arrived, he was already seated, his expression smug as he watched me approach. I noticed immediately how meticulously he'd prepared for this meeting. His hair freshly dyed a shade too dark for his age, designer clothes carefully selected to appear youthful, the telltale tightness around his eyes suggesting recent cosmetic work. Margaret, he greeted me. rising slightly. You're looking well. The hesitation was deliberate, his eyes lingering a fraction too long on my silver-streaked hair and the laugh lines I'd stopped trying to hide years ago. A subtle critique of my simple black dress and minimal makeup. I refused to take the bait. Thanks for meeting me, I replied, keeping my tone businesslike as I slid into the chair opposite him. My hands smoothed my napkin across my lap, a gesture that helped calm the flutter of anxiety in my chest. I think it's important we establish clear parameters for this collaboration. Edward signaled the waiter for another glass of wine. I noticed how he straightened his posture when the young server approached, puffing his chest slightly, speaking with exaggerated confidence. Always so serious. Relax, Maggie. This is a good thing for both of us. Your little sauces get the prestige of a Montgomery restaurant, and I get to help an old friend. Help? I raised an eyebrow, feeling a flare of indignation at the diminutive nickname he knew I disliked. Interesting choice of word, considering our history. He had the decency to look slightly abashed, though it seemed practiced rather than genuine. Ancient history. We've both moved on, clearly. His eyes flicked to my wedding ring. Who's the lucky guy anyway? Someone in the industry? That's not relevant to our business discussion, I deflected, unwilling to give him any personal information he might later use against me. Let's focus on how we'll integrate my products into your menu. Fair enough, he conceded, picking up his wineglass with a hand I noticed wasn't as steady as it once had been. Though I should clarify, it's my menu. I'll decide which of your products to feature and how they'll be used. The next hour was an exercise in restraint as Edward outlined his vision, which essentially involved using my products as minor components in dishes that would primarily showcase his culinary techniques. He leaned forward as he spoke, gesturing expansively, occasionally checking his reflection in the polished silverware. Your tomato sauce has potential as a base for my signature seafood cioppino, he explained condescendingly. With proper enhancement, of course. The sauce is designed to stand on its own, I pointed out, maintaining my composure despite the irritation building inside me. Altering it significantly defeats the purpose of the partnership. Edward's smile tightened, revealing the web of fine lines around his mouth that his careful grooming couldn't disguise. Margaret, this is a 3-star restaurant, not a home kitchen. Everything needs refinement to meet our standards. By the end of dinner, it was clear Edward intended to minimize my product's presence while leveraging the partnership for his own reputation. As we were preparing to leave, he delivered his final blow. One more thing. Victoria suggested we do some joint media appearances to promote the launch. Given your limited experience with high-end press, I'd be happy to take the lead. I took a careful breath, reminding myself that I'd overcome far worse challenges than Edward's condescension. I appreciate the offer, I replied carefully. But I've done quite a bit of media for my brand already. Blog interviews and local morning shows aren't quite the same as the national platforms Victoria has lined up, he counted, adjusting his collar in a way that reminded me of his perpetual self-consciousness. Trust me on this, Maggie. I know what appeals to the luxury market. The use of that nickname again, deliberately undermining, deliberately familiar, made something shift inside me. I'd spent too many years rebuilding myself to let him chip away at my confidence now. Thank you for your insights, Edward, I said, rising and gathering my purse. I'll take them under advisement. Victoria and I will connect tomorrow to finalize details. The subtle emphasis on my direct line to Victoria wasn't lost on him. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face before he masked it with another practiced smile. I managed to maintain my composure until I was safely in my car, then let out a frustrated groan, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Edward wasn't just planning to undermine my products. He was positioning himself to take credit for their success and potentially damage my brand's reputation in the process. When I arrived home, I found Robert in our kitchen testing recipes for his new seasonal menu. The sight of him, focused, creative, passionate without being pretentious, salt and pepper hair untouched by dye, was a striking contrast to the evening I'd just endured. At 59, he wore his age with a natural confidence Edward could never achieve with all his cosmetic enhancements. How was it? He asked, looking up from his notes, his eyes crinkling with genuine concern. Exactly as expected, I sighed, slipping off my shoes and accepting the glass of wine he offered. Edward is still Edward, just with more insecurity and hair dye. Robert wiped his hands on a towel and pulled me into a hug. I leaned into his solid warmth, feeling some of the tension drain from my shoulders. I'm sorry, love. What's your next move? Before I could answer, my phone chimed with an email from Victoria Montgomery. Margaret, I hope your meeting with Edward was productive. Before we proceed further, I'd like to discuss some confidential concerns regarding the executive chef position at the Artisan. Are you available for breakfast tomorrow? Regards, Victoria. That's unexpected, I murmured, showing Robert the message. Maybe not entirely, he replied thoughtfully, his arms still comfortably around my waist. Victoria Montgomery has a reputation for recognizing talent and eliminating problems. The question is, which category she's placed you in, and which one Edward occupies. Victoria's proposal. The next morning, I met Victoria at her penthouse apartment over gourmet coffee and freshly baked croissants. Large windows framed a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, the morning sun glinting off the water. Victoria looked completely at ease in her home environment, dressed in an elegant cashmere sweater that complemented her silver hair. I was struck again by how comfortably she inhabited her age, something I was still learning to do. I'll be direct, Margaret, she said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent behind stylish frames, held mine steadily. I'm considering significant changes at the Artisan, including the executive chef position. I blinked in surprise, my croissant halfway to my mouth. You're firing Edward? Let's say I'm reevaluating our arrangement, she replied carefully, her manicured fingers adjusting the silver bangles on her wrist. Edward has technical skill, but he lacks something essential, the genuine passion and integrity I value in my culinary partners. She paused, studying me intently, crow's feet deepening around her eyes as she narrowed her gaze. What I'm about to propose may seem unusual, but I've done my research. Your culinary background combined with your product development expertise and compelling personal story makes you an ideal candidate to help reshape the Artisan's identity. My heart skipped a beat, the implications of her words slowly sinking in. You're offering me Edward's job? I asked incredulously, aware of a slight tremor in my voice. Not exactly, Victoria clarified, leaning forward slightly. I'm offering you something more significant, a partnership. Your product line featured exclusively at the Artisan, with you serving as culinary director, developing the menu concept, training the kitchen staff on your techniques, and becoming the public face of our rebranded restaurant. The proposition was stunning, a complete reversal of the power dynamic Edward had established. But it also presented an ethical dilemma. Despite everything, deliberately taking Edward's position felt uncomfortably like the vindictive behavior he'd exhibited toward me. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of the ache in my lower back, a reminder of the physical realities of aging that no amount of success could erase. Victoria, I'm flattered, but I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. At my age, taking on such a demanding new role, at your age? Victoria interrupted, one eyebrow raised. Margaret, I bought my first hotel at 62. The at my age concern is something we allow others to impose on us. Her expression softened slightly. Experience isn't a liability. It's your greatest asset. The Artisan doesn't need another ambitious young chef with something to prove. It needs someone who understands food as nourishment for the body and the soul. Sensing my hesitation, Victoria added, This isn't about personal vendettas, Margaret. It's a business decision. Edward was always a temporary solution while I sought the right partner for my vision. The fact that you have history is coincidental, though perhaps karmic. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, revealing a hint of mischief beneath her professional demeanor. As I considered her offer, my phone buzzed with a text from Edward. Victoria loved my ideas for your products. We're proceeding with my vision. Congratulations on finally making it to the big leagues, even if it's just as a supplier. And just like that, my ethical concerns evaporated. I looked up at Victoria, who was watching me with quiet amusement, as if she could guess the nature of the message. I think we have a lot to discuss, I said, straightening my shoulders and feeling a new resolve settle within me. I have some ideas for the Artisan that I'd like to share. I thought you might, Victoria replied, lifting her coffee cup in a subtle toast. To new beginnings. The following weeks were a carefully choreographed dance of preparation and secrecy. Victoria and I agreed that Edward should remain unaware of the coming changes until all arrangements were finalized. Meanwhile, I would proceed with the partnership as planned, allowing him to believe he was in control of the situation. It's not deception, Victoria assured me when I expressed discomfort with the approach. She adjusted the elegant scarf around her neck, a habit I'd noticed when she was thinking strategically. It's strategic timing. Edward's contract includes a performance review clause that gives me complete discretion regarding his continued employment. I threw myself into developing a comprehensive concept for the artisan's reinvention. By day, I ran Nourish and participated in planning meetings with Edward, where I nodded agreeably at his increasingly pretentious menu ideas. By night, I worked with Robert and my team on a vision that would showcase both my products and the artisan's potential. The constant pace was exhausting. Some mornings I would wake with joints stiff from fatigue, wondering if I had overcommitted. Then I would remember Edward's dismissive texts, his condescending attitude toward my little sauces, and find renewed energy. This wasn't just about proving him wrong, it was about claiming the professional respect I'd earned through decades of work. 3 weeks before the scheduled launch, Victoria called an all-staff meeting at the restaurant. I arrived early, my stomach in knots. Despite my confidence in our plan, confrontation had never been my strength. Edward positioned himself prominently at Victoria's side, clearly expecting some sort of endorsement or announcement about his brilliant new menu concept. His hair was freshly dyed, his chef's whites pristine, his posture radiating self-assurance. As you know, we've been preparing for a significant relaunch, Victoria began, addressing the gathered staff with the quiet authority that had built her empire. Today, I'm pleased to announce our new culinary partnership with Nourish by Margaret. Edward smiled smugly, reaching to shake my hand for the cameras documenting the event. What you may not know, Victoria continued, her voice cutting through the polite applause, is that Margaret Smith isn't just a successful product developer. She's also a culinary visionary whose personal journey from food blogger to industry innovator embodies exactly what the artisan aims to represent. Edward's smile faltered slightly as Victoria gestured for me to join her at the front. Effective immediately, Margaret will be joining our team as culinary director, overseeing the complete reconceptualization of the artisan's menu and dining experience. The room erupted in applause as I stepped forward. Through the flashing cameras, I watched Edward's expression shift from confusion to shock and finally to anger. His face flushed, highlighting the contrast between his artificially dark hair and the natural aging of his skin. What exactly does that mean for my position? He asked, his voice tight, a muscle working in his jaw. Victoria answered smoothly. We'll discuss the details privately, but essentially, you'll be reporting to Margaret on all culinary matters moving forward. I met his gaze steadily, seeing the fury building behind his eyes. For a moment, I felt a flash of sympathy. I knew all too well how it felt to have career expectations suddenly upended. But then I remembered his casual cruelty over the years, his willingness to sacrifice my business for his convenience, and my resolve strengthened. The meeting continued with a presentation of the new concept, a seasonal, narrative-driven menu that celebrated the stories behind exceptional ingredients. Throughout, Edward remained rigid with barely contained fury, his posture growing more tense with each slide that featured my products prominently. Afterwards, he cornered me in the kitchen, away from the lingering staff and photographers. Is this your idea of revenge? He hissed, leaning close enough that I could see the careful concealer under his eyes. You manipulated Victoria just to get back at me. This is business, Edward, I replied calmly, maintaining eye contact despite his intimidating stance. Victoria made a decision based on what's best for her restaurant. I won't work under you, he declared, his voice rising slightly. It's professionally demeaning and frankly absurd. You didn't even finish culinary school. I felt an unexpected surge of confidence as I looked at him, this man who had once held such power over my self-image. That's your choice, I said, smoothing my jacket over my hips. I'm sure Victoria will accept your resignation if that's what you decide. His face flushed deeper with anger. This isn't over, he warned, turning sharply and pushing through the kitchen doors. Later that day, I learned that Edward had gone directly to Victoria, threatening to quit unless my role was reconsidered. To my surprise, she had accepted his resignation on the spot and announced it to the kitchen staff. The timing is unfortunate, she told me over the phone, but perhaps it's for the best. A clean break allows us to move forward without lingering tension. While I agreed in principle, Edward's abrupt departure created immediate practical challenges. The head sous chef was competent but inexperienced with menu development. The kitchen staff, accustomed to Edward's autocratic style, seemed uncertain about the new hierarchy. And most critically, we now had less than 3 weeks to finalize and test an entirely new menu before the high-profile relaunch. Crisis before launch. I called an emergency meeting with my Nourish team and Robert, explaining the situation in my living room as we gathered around the coffee table covered with menu drafts and supply chain reports. My body ached with fatigue, a reminder of the physical limitations that came with my 55 years, but my mind was sharp with determination. I need to be on site at the Artisan full-time until this is resolved, I concluded, tucking a strand of silver-streaked hair behind my ear. Can you handle things here? They assured me they could manage Nourish's operations temporarily, but Robert looked concerned, the lines around his eyes deepening. You're taking on an impossible timeline, he warned, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Even established restaurant teams need months to develop and perfect new concepts. I don't have months, I replied, feeling the weight of the opportunity and the challenge pressing down on me. This opportunity won't come again. I didn't add what we both knew, that at my age, with my background, such chances were increasingly rare. The next 20 days were the most intense of my professional life. I practically lived at the Artisan, working alongside the kitchen staff to develop and refine dishes that told a cohesive story while featuring my products organically within the menu. My joints protested the long hours standing in the kitchen, but I pushed through, determined not to let physical discomfort become a limitation. Progress was uneven, complicated by passive resistance from a few staff members loyal to Edward. The head sommelier, a young man who'd been hired on Edward's recommendation, was particularly difficult, questioning my wine pairings with barely concealed skepticism. With all due respect, Miss Smith, he said during one tasting, his tone suggesting little respect at all. These selections lack the sophistication our clientele expects. I took a measured breath, aware of the other staff watching this exchange. Daniel, I understand your concern, I replied evenly. But we're deliberately moving away from intimidating wine lists toward more approachable, food-friendly options that enhance rather than overshadow the ingredients. It's a different philosophy, not a lesser one. Slowly, I began winning over the skeptics. My willingness to work alongside them, to taste and adjust rather than dictate, gradually earned their respect. By the end of the second week, even Daniel was bringing me wines to sample, interested in my perspective. Just when we seemed to be finding our rhythm, disaster struck. 1 week before the relaunch, food critic and influencer Michael Green posted an exclusive preview of the Artisan's troubles on his widely followed blog. Sources close to the Artisan report chaotic conditions following the unexpected departure of executive chef Edward Harris. Owner Victoria Montgomery has reportedly replaced him with Margaret Smith, a home economist with no formal culinary training or restaurant experience. Industry insiders are skeptical about this unconventional choice for one of Chicago's most prestigious dining establishments, particularly given Smith's focus on the senior market. The damaging post, clearly fed by Edward, was already generating buzz in culinary circles. Reservation cancellations began trickling in, and several planned media features were put on hold pending the actual launch. The phrase "focus on the senior market" particularly stung, a deliberate attempt to position my products as niche rather than universal. Victoria called me to her office, her expression grave. "This is problematic, Margaret," she said, gesturing to the blog post displayed on her tablet. "The hospitality industry runs on perception as much as reality." I nodded, feeling a familiar sinking sensation. Once again, Edward had found a way to sabotage me just as success seemed within reach. But this time, as I looked at Victoria, a woman who had built an empire in her 60s, I refused to accept defeat. "Give me 24 hours, I told her, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. "I think I know how to turn this around." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with the kitchen team. As they gathered, uncertain and worried, I made a decision to be completely transparent. "You've all seen the blog post," I began, looking around at their faces, some young enough to be my children, others closer to my age. And I'm sure you're wondering if hitching your wagon to my star was a mistake. A few uncomfortable smiles acknowledged the truth of this. I won't pretend I have the same credentials as Chef Harris. What I do have is 25 years of creating recipes that resonate with real people. And I have all of you, your talent, your knowledge, your skills. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settling over me. Tomorrow, instead of our scheduled testing, I want to invite Michael Green and a select group of food writers to an impromptu tasting. Not our planned menu, something more immediate and honest. Each of you will create one dish that represents your personal culinary story, incorporating one of my products in a way that feels authentic to you. The room was silent for a moment. Then Daniel, surprisingly, spoke up. What if they hate it? I smiled, feeling the laugh lines around my eyes deepen. Then we failed trying something real, rather than succeeding with something contrived. By midnight, the invitations had been sent. By morning, somewhat to my shock, all had been accepted. The kitchen buzzed with focused energy as each chef prepared their signature dish. I moved among them, tasting, suggesting, encouraging, but never dictating. This would be a true collaboration. At 7 that evening, as Michael Green and 11 other influential food writers took their seats at our chef's table, I felt an odd sense of peace. I stepped out from the kitchen, aware of my age, my lack of formal credentials, and strangely, no longer caring about either. Welcome to the new artisan, I said simply. Tonight isn't about showcasing a perfect, polished concept. It's about honesty, collaboration, and the stories food can tell. Each dish you'll taste tonight represents a personal narrative from one of our chefs, incorporating elements from my own culinary journey. We hope you'll join us in this conversation. What followed was unlike any tasting I'd ever been part of. As each chef presented their creation, they shared the personal connection behind it. Daniel served a surprisingly humble Alsatian white with his grandmother's fish stew, enhanced with my preserved lemon paste. Our youngest line cook presented a modern take on the Filipino dishes of her childhood, incorporating my spice blends. I watched Michael Green's face as he tasted each offering, saw his initial skepticism give way to genuine interest. When dessert was served, a simple apple tart made with my bourbon vanilla sauce, presented by our pastry chef who spoke movingly about learning to bake with her father, I saw Michael discreetly take additional notes. The evening ended with spontaneous applause from the writers. As they left, several stopped to speak with me personally. Their questions focused not on my age or credentials, but on the philosophy behind the new artisan. 2 days later, Michael's new blog post appeared. The Artisan Reborn. Authenticity over artifice: what happens when a restaurant values personal connection over pretension, collaboration over hierarchy, and genuine flavor over culinary gymnastics? Something rather remarkable, as it turns out. Under Margaret Smith's unconventional leadership, the Artisan is being transformed into something Chicago's dining scene didn't know it needed: a restaurant with a soul. By opening night, the reservations book was full once again, with a waiting list stretching into the following month. Victoria called to congratulate me, her voice warm with approval. You did exactly what I hoped you would, she said. You made it about the food and the people, not about yourself or your credentials. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the window of my office at the Artisan: silver hair, laugh lines, the slight softening of my jawline that came with middle age. For the first time in years, I didn't immediately catalog these signs of aging as flaws to be downplayed. They were simply part of the face of a woman who had survived, adapted, and ultimately thrived. Edward's attempt to use my age against me had backfired. In embracing rather than hiding the perspective that came with my years of experience, I'd found my strongest competitive advantage. Epilogue. 2 years later. 7 years after Edward dumped me for Veronica, I was celebrating the second anniversary of the Artisan's wildly successful relaunch. What had begun as a crisis had transformed into a triumph. My emergency solution to Michael Green's damaging post had been to host an intimate preview dinner for select food writers and social media influencers, allowing them to experience the new concept firsthand rather than relying on rumors. The authentic, story-driven menu had resonated powerfully, generating the positive buzz we needed to survive the initial controversy. Now at 57, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined when Edward had dismissed me as too old, too inexperienced, too everything. The artisan boasted its own Michelin star, and my expanded role as culinary director for all Montgomery restaurants had made me a recognized figure in the industry. The deep laugh lines around my eyes and the silver that now dominated my once brown hair felt like badges of honor rather than signs of decline. I was dining with Robert, now my husband of 3 years, at Lesties to celebrate both our professional success and our recent news. Nourished by Margaret had just been acquired by a major food corporation for a sum that would ensure our financial security for life. Robert's hand rested comfortably over mine on the table, his gold wedding band catching the light. That's when I spotted him, Edward, seated near the entrance with a significantly older woman dripping in expensive jewelry. He looked essentially the same, the hair dyed perhaps a shade too dark, but his face showed the strain of the years despite obvious cosmetic work. The slight paunch at his waistline suggested his body was rebelling against his desperate attempts to maintain youth. When he noticed me, his initial shock quickly morphed into a sneer. After excusing himself from his companion, he stopped by our table, shoulders squared in a posture of forced confidence. Well, Margaret Smith, he drawled, pointedly ignoring Robert. This isn't really your scene, is it? Still playing culinary director at Victoria's little restaurant? Before I could respond, Robert extended his hand. Actually, it's Margaret Daniels now. I don't believe we formally met. Robert Daniels. Edward's brow furrowed slightly as he reluctantly shook Robert's hand, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the name. Daniels. Why does that sound familiar? Perhaps because I own this restaurant, Robert replied pleasantly, his salt and pepper hair and lined face radiating an easy confidence that Edward's cosmetic enhancements couldn't replicate. Among others. The color drained from Edward's face as understanding dawned. You're that Robert Daniels. The Robert Daniels? The very same, Robert confirmed, slipping his arm around my waist. Though these days I'm perhaps better known as Margaret's husband, but then again, in culinary circles, who isn't? He smiled warmly at me, the crow's feet around his eyes deepening with genuine affection. My brilliant wife's empire now includes 15 restaurants and a product line in every premium grocery store in the country. Edward stood frozen, visibly processing this information. I could almost see him recalculating his standing, trying to find some way to maintain his dignity. Don't you know who she is? Robert continued, his tone conversational but pointed. Margaret Daniels, the woman who revolutionized chef-quality home products and earned 3 James Beard nominations in the process. The woman who transformed the artisan from a struggling establishment into the crown jewel of the Montgomery portfolio. Edward's face cycled through emotions. Shock, disbelief, and finally a desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. I noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his too tight collar. You've certainly come a long way from that scared culinary school dropout, he managed, his voice strained. Congratulations on your success. Thank you, I replied simply, feeling no need to diminish him further. He was doing that quite effectively himself. And you? Still working as a private chef? He straightened his shoulders, a gesture I recognized from our past, his defense mechanism when feeling inferior. I'm the personal executive chef for Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins. He gestured toward his dining companion, an elegant woman who appeared to be in her mid-70s. She's very particular about her cuisine. I'm sure she is, Robert said, his tone pleasant but his eyes evaluating Eleanor Jenkins with a professional's assessment. Wasn't she on the board of that art foundation that had the embezzlement scandal last year? Edward's smile faltered, fine lines appearing around his mouth despite the Botox. She was cleared of all involvement. Of course, Robert nodded. Her husband wasn't so fortunate, as I recall. The woman at Edward's table was now watching our interaction with obvious impatience. She tapped her watch pointedly when Edward glanced her way, her expression making it clear he was on borrowed time. I should get back, he muttered, a flush creeping up his neck. Eleanor doesn't like to be kept waiting. As he turned to leave, I couldn't resist one final observation. You know, Edward, you once told me I'd never succeed without you, that I needed to attach myself to someone influential to open doors. It's interesting how life turns out, isn't it? He paused, his back stiffening. We all make our choices. Yes, I agreed, feeling the weight of the years between us. years that had broken me down and rebuilt me stronger. And I chose to build something on my own terms. After he retreated to his table, Robert raised his champagne glass. To choices, he toasted, and to the most remarkable woman I've ever pursued, who made me work for a full year just to get a first date. I clinked my glass against his, feeling a contentment that went bone deep. Best decision I ever made. As we enjoyed our meal, I occasionally caught glimpses of Edward stealing glances our way, watching as industry leaders stopped by our table to pay respects, as the head chef emerged from the kitchen to personally discuss his newest creations with us. As Robert and I laughed and celebrated our shared success, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Edward, dependent on the whims and wealth of an aging socialite, versus the life I'd built through determination, integrity, and genuine talent. Later that evening, as Robert and I were leaving, the maitre d' handed me an envelope. From the gentleman with Mrs. Jenkins, he explained discreetly. Inside was a business card with a hastily scrawled note. We should catch up properly sometime. I've got some culinary concepts that might interest you. Edward. I slipped the card into the donation box by the door, exchanging a knowing smile with Robert. At 57, I was already focusing on tomorrow's plans and possibilities. A cooking school for cancer survivors, expanding our charitable foundation, perhaps writing the cookbook I'd been considering. The past had no hold on me anymore. I was too busy looking forward to my next chapter.